The morning was still damp when the elderly couple stood by the empty road, as if the world had forgotten them there. The man clutched the handle of an old, worn leather suitcase. The woman held a trembling puppy tightly against her chest. Too small, too white for the grey landscape, their children's car was just a vanishing speck between the curves of the hill. The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an open wound. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The road seemed wider now that they were alone. Colder too, despite the shy sun beginning to peek through the low clouds. The asphalt still gleamed from the early morning rain, reflecting a sky that was half grimy, half uncertain. The man looked at the suitcase he held and felt its weight increase, not from the objects inside, but from what it represented. Everything left of a lifetime fit into a single old bag. The woman took a deep breath, like someone trying to hold back what was about to collapse within her. She didn't want to cry. Not here, not yet. The puppy in her lap trembled not just from the cold, but from fear, as if it understood that something very wrong had just happened. It was a little mutt, white with grey patches, with floppy ears and eyes too big for its face. It had been a gift from their grandchildren months ago, on an afternoon when everyone still smiled together around the dining table. Now, the grandchildren hadn't even looked back when the car pulled away. The man ran a hand over his face, rough with stubble, and let out a long sigh. It wasn't a sigh of exhaustion, but of resignation, as if something inside him had finally accepted that things were just the way they were, that there was nothing more to do, that life had turned a page, and he was stuck on the previous one. But at the same time, there was something stubborn in the way he held his shoulders firm, as if dignity was the last thing no one could take from him. She looked at her husband and saw what he didn't say. She saw 52 years of marriage in the way he walked. She saw all the promises they made to each other, all the silly arguments, all the breakfasts shared, all the nights holding hands, everything they built together. And she also saw what was broken now, what their children had done without realizing it, or perhaps realizing it but not caring. The puppy lifted its head and pressed its cold snout against her skin. A small gesture, but so full of meaning that it was enough to break her inside. The woman closed her eyes, like someone receiving a hug she hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. A single tear ran down, warm against her cold skin, and she let it fall. Just one. Then she composed herself. They didn't know it, but at that moment life was already conspiring in their favor. What would come next? No one could have imagined. It had all started weeks earlier, when their children showed up at the old farmhouse with their gentle talk, full of certainties. All three came together, the oldest, the middle, and the youngest. As if they had rehearsed every word, every gesture, every argument. They sat on the porch, accepted the coffee their mother brought, and began talking about what was best for everyone. The house was too old, they said, too far from town. Dangerous for two elderly people living alone, too costly to maintain. The neighbors were moving away. The road was getting worse every year. The power flickered. The water came out dirty. It was time to move, to accept that that phase was over. They would take care of everything. Their parents just needed to trust them. Arthur and Martha listened in silence. She stirred her coffee cup without drinking. He looked at the yard where the peach tree they planted together still bore fruit every summer. 40 years in that house. 40 years of waking to the rooster's crow, watering the plants, chatting on the porch with neighbors, raising their children, burying 2 dogs under the old oak tree, watching life pass slowly and full of meaning. But their children spoke beautifully. They spoke of a small apartment in the city, practical, with everything nearby, with them nearby too. They spoke of security, comfort, care. They spoke so much that it seemed true, and deep down the old couple wanted to believe. They wanted to believe that their children loved them enough to do what was best. So they signed papers they didn't quite understand, but which their children said were just formalities. The house sold too quickly. The furniture was taken, distributed, donated. Their clothes selected, their memories packed away, and when they realized what was happening, it was already too late. There was no apartment in the city. There were postponed promises. There were meetings they weren't invited to. There were decisions made without consultation. There was a growing feeling that they had been deceived, but without being able to pinpoint exactly where the lie began. And then, on a misty morning, the children appeared with the car. They said they would take their parents to settle everything once and for all. They put the suitcase in the trunk, the puppy in their mother's lap, and left. They drove in silence, avoiding questions, averting their gaze. The road grew increasingly empty, the landscape more unfamiliar. When the car stopped, it was in a place they had never seen. The middle of the road, nothing around but brush and the cold morning wind. The children got out, took the suitcase, handed it to their father with a blank look. The oldest mumbled something about sending updates. The middle one waved without conviction. The youngest didn't even turn around. And they left. Just like that. Like returning unwanted items. Like discarding what bothers you. Like choosing one's own comfort and calling it necessity. The couple stood there holding the suitcase and the dog as the sound of the engine faded into the distance. The wind blew harder, and the woman pulled her shawl tighter over her shoulders. The man looked both ways down the road and saw nothing but loneliness, but he didn't know that suitcase held more than old clothes. He didn't know that inside it was something that would change everything. He didn't know that his children's betrayal, as terrible as it was about to reveal a much greater truth. In that instant, their destiny was already decided, but no one realized it. The puppy began to whimper, restless, as if sensing their fear. The woman pressed it tighter against her chest and whispered soft words, more to calm herself than the animal. The man remained standing, heavy, the suitcase in his hand, his eyes fixed on the spot where the car had disappeared. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had become strange, stretched out, shapeless. A few cars passed, too fast to notice two lost elderly people. A truck slowed but didn't stop. A motorcycle zigzagged past them as if they were ghosts. It was when the sun was higher, burning the man's neck, that they heard the rumble of an old engine approaching. A faded blue flatbed truck, its bed full of tied-down boxes. The driver was a big man with calloused hands and days of beard growth, wearing a plaid shirt stained with grease. He slowed when he saw them, frowned, and stopped. A few yards ahead, he got out slowly, looking at the scene with that expression of someone who has seen too much in life to be surprised, but still feels when something is very wrong. He walked toward them, his heavy boots clattering on the asphalt. "You folks all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse but not threatening. Arthur and Martha exchanged glances. They didn't know what to say. Were they all right? No. But how to explain? The driver noticed their silence and looked around, trying to understand the situation. He saw the old suitcase, the trembling puppy, the empty road. In both directions, he saw their age, their simple clothes, the lost look of people who didn't know where to go. And he understood more than any words could say. "Someone leave you out here?" he asked directly, but kindly. Martha nodded, her voice caught in her throat. Arthur lowered his head. The driver sighed deeply, shook his head like someone lamenting the world's cruelty, and simply said, "Get in. Nobody deserves to be alone like this." And the way he said "nobody" made Martha swallow her tears, and Arthur tighten his grip on the suitcase handle. Because in that word was everything their children lacked: humanity. The dog was the first to react, wagging its tail for the first time since they had been abandoned, as if it knew this man was different. They climbed into the truck's cab with difficulty, Arthur helping Martha, the driver holding the suitcase. The seat was hard and smelled of diesel, but it was warm from the sun. The puppy settled into Martha's lap and finally stopped trembling. The rumble of the engine filled the silence that had been hurting them since morning. The driver asked no questions. He just turned the radio on low to a station playing old country music and started driving. The road wound up and down between hills covered with pasture and a few patches of woods. It was beautiful, in a somewhat sad way, like everything too far from big cities. The sky gradually brightened and the light grew more golden, softer. After a few miles, the driver cleared his throat and said, without taking his eyes off the road, "You folks got somewhere to go?" Arthur looked out the window. Martha caressed the dog's head. Neither of them answered immediately, because the truth was no. They didn't. They didn't even know where they were. "There's a small town about 25 miles from here," the driver continued, sensing the answer in their silence. "There's a boarding house. The owner's a bit tough, but she's got a heart. I can drop you off there. At least it's a roof over your heads." Arthur nodded slowly, speechless. Martha whispered a "thank you" so softly it almost got lost in the engine noise. The driver nodded and sped up a little. They remained silent for the rest of the way, each lost in their own thoughts. The radio played an old folk tune, the kind that speaks of longing and distance, and it seemed like the perfect soundtrack for that moment. Martha looked out the window and thought of her children. She tried to understand when it had started, when their love had turned into obligation, when obligation had turned into annoyance, when annoyance had turned into abandonment. She remembered each one as a baby crying in the middle of the night, and how she always woke up without questioning. She remembered the fevers, the falls, the night fears. She remembered sleepless nights, food made with the little they had, clothes sewn by hand because there was no money to buy them. And now they didn't even look back. Arthur thought similar things, but in a different way. He thought of the hours worked under the sun, the sweat running down as he carried heavy loads, the backaches every evening. He thought of everything he gave up so they could have. He thought of the times he said yes when he wanted to say no, the times he stayed silent when he wanted to shout, the times he swallowed his pride so his children wouldn't be embarrassed, and now he held an old suitcase in the middle of nowhere, discarded like something worthless, but he said none of this. He kept it all inside, as he always had, because a man his age learned that pain is carried in silence. The truck turned onto a dirt road and began to shake more. Dust rose along the sides, and the puppy pricked up its ears, curious. In the distance, the first houses of the small town began to appear. Simple constructions, exposed brick, some painted in faded colors. There was a little white church on top of a hill, a general store with a striped awning, a town square with old benches and a huge tree in the middle. The driver parked in front of a larger two-story house with a wooden sign hanging on the porch. The St. Anthony Inn. The paint was peeling, but it was readable. There were flowers planted in old cans by the entrance and a rocking chair on the porch. "Here we are," the driver said, turning off the engine. "Wait a bit. I'll talk to Mrs. Eleanor Vance first." He got out and walked to the door. He knocked 3 times, hard, and waited. A woman appeared, with grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, a floral apron, and the expression of someone who didn't like to be disturbed. She and the driver spoke in low voices, he gesticulating toward the truck. The woman looked over, frowned, crossed her arms. It seemed like she was going to say no, but the driver insisted. He spoke more, pointed to the couple, made a gesture with his hands that seemed to explain something important. The woman sighed, looked again, and something in her face softened. Not much, but enough. The driver returned, and Open the truck door. You can come down. She'll let you stay. Martha descended carefully, holding the dog tightly. Arthur picked up the suitcase and felt its weight increase again, as if each step cost more. They walked to the porch where Mrs. Eleanor Vance waited, her arms still crossed, but her gaze less harsh. "No animals," she said directly. "That's the house rule." The puppy, as if it understood, barked softly, almost pleadingly. Martha pressed it against her chest and felt its rapid breathing, felt its little heart beating too fast. She looked at the innkeeper and said with a firmness that surprised even herself, "Then we'll sleep on the street, but he stays with us." There was a heavy silence. The driver looked from one to the other. Arthur waited, tense. The dog stopped barking and became quiet, as if it knew its fate was being decided at that instant. Mrs. Eleanor Vance looked at Martha, at the dog, at Arthur bent with exhaustion, and something inside her gave way. Perhaps it was the memory of an old loss. Perhaps it was just tiredness from being tough all the time. Perhaps it was the way that couple leaned on each other, even broken. "All right, stay," she murmured, her voice almost a sigh. "But take good care. If he makes a mess, if he barks at night, you'll leave. Understood?" "Understood," Arthur replied, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. Mrs. Eleanor Vance nodded and opened the door. The driver helped with the suitcase, carrying it up the narrow stairs to a small room on the second floor. It was simple, almost empty. A double bed with a faded quilt, an old wooden dresser, a chair against the wall, a small window overlooking the yard. But it had a roof. It had walls. It had a place to lie down and close their eyes. The driver placed the suitcase on the floor and turned to leave. Arthur grabbed his arm, searching for words he didn't find. The driver just nodded, a small smile on his tired face, and said, "Life turns around, old-timer. Sometimes we think it's over, but it's just a bend in the road." And he left, leaving those words hanging in the air like a promise. The couple stood there, in the middle of the room, not quite knowing what to do now. The puppy jumped from Martha's lap and began sniffing everything, curious, exploring every corner. Martha sat on the edge of the bed, slowly, and felt the mattress sink. Arthur went to the window and looked out. There was a yard with clothes drying on the line, chickens scratching, a big dog sleeping in the shade of a tree. It was strange to be in a place that wasn't theirs, surrounded by things they didn't know, far from everything that was once home. But it was also strange to feel, for the first time in weeks, that perhaps they would survive. Martha lay on her side and closed her eyes. Exhaustion fell over her like a wave. Arthur remained at the window, his hands resting on the sill, his shoulders hunched. The dog, after exploring everything, returned to Martha's side and curled up on the floor, next to the bed. None of them touched the suitcase. It remained there, in the corner of the room, like a secret yet to be revealed. The afternoon passed slowly. The small town was quiet, the kind of silence that only exists far from cities, made of wind in the trees, chickens scratching, children playing in the street. Occasionally, the sound of neighbors talking, a laugh, a door slamming, would drift over. Martha woke when the sun was already lower, golden light streaming through the window. Arthur had pulled up the chair and was sitting near her, his head resting against the wall, sleeping too. The dog remained curled up in the same spot. She got up slowly, so as not to wake anyone, and went to the suitcase. She knelt in front of it and stared, as if before something dangerous. The suitcase was old. It had belonged to her father-in-law, passed down to them when the old man died almost 15 years ago. She had never paid much attention to it before. It was just a suitcase, an object, something to hold other things. But now there was something different, a feeling, an intuition. She ran her hand over the worn leather surface, feeling the cracks, the marks of time. It smelled of mold and earth, like things stored for too long. The buckles were rusty metal, the corners reinforced with old rivets. The dog woke and came to her, sniffing the suitcase with interest. It began to scratch lightly, as if wanting to open it, as if it knew there was something important inside. Martha looked at it, intrigued. "What is it, little one?" she whispered. "What do you sense?" The animal insisted, scratching more, whimpering softly. Martha looked at her husband, still sleeping, and decided to open it. The rusty buckles gave way with difficulty. She lifted the lid slowly, almost afraid of what she would find. Inside were folded clothes, the few things their children had left them. Arthur's old shirts, her simple dresses, some socks, a coat. Nothing much, nothing to justify the dog's interest. But the animal continued to insist, scratching the bottom of the suitcase, barking softly, impatiently. It was then that Martha realized the bottom seemed higher than it should be, thicker. She ran her hand over it and felt an irregularity, a difference in texture. She pressed lightly and heard an almost imperceptible click, as if something had come loose. Her heart quickened. Martha looked back. Her husband still slept, his breathing heavy from someone who hadn't truly rested in a long time. She turned her attention back to the suitcase, her heart beating faster now, her hands trembling slightly. The dog sat beside her, suddenly quiet, as if expecting something important. She pushed the leather bottom harder and felt it give way, a false bottom, a hidden compartment. For all these years it had been stored there, in silence, waiting. Inside were envelopes yellowed with age, tied with a thin string. Papers carefully folded, a small, hard-bound notebook with a worn cover, and a metal box the size of a book, closed but unlocked. The woman held everything with trembling hands and placed it on her lap. The dog sniffed the papers, satisfied, as if saying, "I told you so." She untied the string slowly, almost with reverence, and began to open the first envelope. They were documents, old but carefully preserved, land deeds, certificates, court records with faded stamps, and there, in old cursive script, was her husband's name. Properties registered in his name, land she hadn't even known existed, inheritances that had never been mentioned, his father-in-law's land that no one knew was still in the family's name. She read slowly, trying to understand, the words dancing before her eyes. They were plots of land on the border with another state. They weren't vast fortunes, not huge ranches, but they were something. They were roots. They were a proof that they had come from somewhere, that they had a right to something, that they weren't just disposable old folks. And there was more. At the bottom of the envelope, a letter, handwritten in a shaky but firm hand. Martha recognized her father-in-law's handwriting immediately. He had died when he was still strong in her memory, a quiet, stern man, but fair. A man who never wasted words. She opened the letter and began to read, her voice low, almost a whisper. "My son, if you are reading this, it is because I am no longer here, and it is because you need to know things I didn't have the courage to say in life. I was never good with words, you know. I learned to speak with my hands, with work, with silence. But there are things that silence cannot carry alone. These lands are yours. They always have been. I kept the documents in this place because I knew that one day you would need them. Not when everything is easy, but when it is hard. When the world turns its back. When even those you love forget to look back. I know what it's like, son. I went through it too. I raised my children thinking that love would be enough, thinking that care would generate gratitude, thinking that sacrifice would be remembered. But life teaches that it isn't always so. People forget quickly. They forget where they came from. They forget who carried them on their backs when they couldn't walk alone. That's why I kept this here. For when the love of others is lacking, for when you need to remember that you have roots, that you have history, that you have worth, even when they try to make you believe you don't. These Lands are not worth a fortune, but they are worth dignity. And dignity, son, is the only thing no one can take from you. Unless you let them. Don't let them, no matter how much it hurts, no matter how much it wounds. Don't let them, your father. Tears streamed down Martha's face before she could hold them back. She read it again slowly, each word weighing like lead, and at the same time lifting something within her. An ancient strength, a certainty that had been buried under years of submission, of obedience, of accepting what they were told she should accept. Arthur woke to the sound of her stifled crying. He opened his eyes slowly, confused, and saw his wife kneeling beside the suitcase, papers spread on her lap, her face wet. He got up quickly, despite the pain in his back, and went to her. "What happened?" he asked, his voice still hoarse with sleep. She didn't answer immediately. She just held out the letter to him, her hands trembling. He took it, sat on the floor beside her, and began to read. She watched the expressions change on his face. Confusion, surprise, emotion, understanding. She saw the way he gripped the paper tighter with each line, as if he needed to hold on to something solid. When he finished, he remained silent for a long time, just looking at the letter, rereading passages, letting his dead father's words penetrate deep. Then he looked at his wife, at the documents on her lap, at the open suitcase with its secret finally revealed. "How long has this been here?" he whispered. 15 years, she replied. "Since your father died. 15 years waiting for us to need it." He ran a hand over his face, wiping his eyes before the tears could fall. But it was no use. They came anyway, silent, heavy, full of everything he didn't know he needed to cry about. Martha picked up the land documents and began to explain, her voice still trembling. "It's land, honey. Land in your family's name. In your name. Not much, but it's something. It's proof that we came from somewhere. That we have a right to something." He took the papers, looked at the stamps, the names, the measurements. He tried to understand the formal language of the county clerk's office, the technical descriptions, the property boundaries. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. He understood that this meant they weren't nothing, that they had roots, that they had history. "My children sold my house," he said, his voice breaking. "But they didn't know about this. They didn't know my father kept something for me, that I had more than they thought." "It's not just the land," Martha continued, opening the small notebook. "There's more." The notebook was full of notes, numbers, accounts, records of savings his father-in-law had made over the years. Small amounts saved in different places, in different names, in different banks, in forgotten small towns. It wasn't wealth, but it was sustenance. It was enough to start over. On the last page of the notebook, there was another message. Use wisely. Use with dignity. And remember, money comes and goes, but land endures. But what never dies is how you get up after you fall. The couple sat there on the bedroom floor, surrounded by papers and memories, holding each other's hands. The dog lay down between them, its snout resting on Martha's leg, as if understanding the importance of that moment. Outside, the sun continued to set, painting the sky orange and pink. The small town grew quiet, preparing for the night. But inside that small room, something was awakening, a strength, a decision. A realization that life hadn't ended, that perhaps it was just beginning anew, in a different way. Martha picked up the metal box that was still closed. It was too light to hold anything valuable, but too heavy to be empty. She opened it slowly and found photographs. Old black and white photos, yellowed at the edges. Photos of her father-in-law as a young man, working the land, covered in mud up to his knees. Photos of her mother-in-law, long deceased, smiling with a baby in her arms. Her husband, small, defenseless, looking at the camera with huge eyes. Photos of a life built with hands, of a family that came from nothing and made something, that planted, harvested, built walls, raised children, endured. That wasn't famous, wasn't rich, wasn't remembered in books, but that existed with dignity. And at the bottom of the box, beneath all the photos, a small note written in a more recent hand, probably in her father-in-law's last days. "Son, if you've forgotten where you came from, these photos will remind you. If you've forgotten who you are, your blood will remind you. If you've forgotten your worth, your history will remind you. Don't let anyone, not even your children, make you believe you are nothing, because you are everything I built, and I built with pride." Arthur held the photo of himself as a baby in his long-dead mother's arms, and finally let the tears come with full force. He cried as he hadn't cried since childhood. He cried for everything he lost, for everything that hurt, for everything that was taken from him. But he also cried because, for the first time in weeks, he felt he had something beyond the pain. He had memory, he had roots, he had a father who thought of him even after death. Martha hugged her husband, let him cry on her shoulder, stroked his white hair, whispered that everything would be all right, that they would be all right, that they would find a way, and for the first time, when she said it, she believed it. The dog began to lick their hands, as if wanting to participate in that moment, as if wanting to say that it too was there, that it too wasn't leaving, that they were a family. Now, the three of them, against whatever came. Night fell completely. Mrs. Eleanor Vance knocked on the door to announce that dinner was ready. They went down, their eyes still red, but their shoulders straighter. They ate in silence at the kitchen table, a simple meal of stew and bread, but it tasted of dignity, of a new beginning, of possibility. Afterward, they returned to their room. They carefully put away the documents, reorganized everything in the suitcase's secret compartment, and locked the buckles. Arthur placed the suitcase under the bed, where he could see it, where he knew it was. Protected. They lay down together. The dog curled at their feet and held hands in the dark. They didn't need to speak. They had already said everything with their silence, with their tears, with the way they squeezed each other's fingers. Tomorrow, they would have to think about what to do. They would have to find those places, verify those documents, understand their rights, claim what was theirs. They would have to make decisions. But today, just today, it was enough to know that they had something beyond abandonment, that they had been remembered, that they had worth, that they weren't completely alone because the past had come to their rescue when the present gave up, and that, for now, was enough to keep breathing. The next morning arrived with a shy sun and the sound of roosters crowing in the distance. Arthur woke first, as he always did, his body aching but his mind strangely clear. For the first time in a long time, he didn't wake with that feeling of weight in his chest, that tightness that came with the awareness of abandonment. Today was different. Today he had a purpose. He rose slowly, so as not to wake. His wife put on his pants and shirt and splashed water on his face from a basin in the corner of the room. The dog stretched, yawned, showing its small teeth, and came wagging its tail, asking for affection. He scratched behind the animal's ears and whispered, "Today we're going to find out what's ours, little one. Today we start over." He descended the narrow stairs and found Mrs. Eleanor Vance already in the kitchen, preparing coffee. The strong, good smell filled the air. She looked at him with that still somewhat reserved expression, but nodded, indicating he could sit. "Coffee? Please." She poured it into a dented aluminum mug and placed bread on the table, along with a piece of cheese and butter. He ate slowly, savoring it, and then cleared his throat. "Do you know anyone here who understands documents? Land deeds?" She looked at him, curious. "Why? You own land?" "Possibly. I need to confirm. I need someone who knows how to read these county clerk papers." Mrs. Eleanor Vance refilled her own mug, blew on the hot coffee and thought for a moment. There's old Walt Thompson. He was a county clerk for 30 years before. He retired, lives just up the street, blue house with an iron gate, a bit grumpy but honest. If there's anyone around here who understands those papers, it's him. Arthur thanked her and went back up to the room. Martha was already awake, combing her white hair in front of the small, cracked mirror on the wall. She turned when he entered. "I found someone," he said, "someone who can help us understand these documents." She nodded, her eyes shining with something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope, perhaps, or determination, or both mixed together, feeding off each other. They took the most important papers from the secret compartment, put them in an old envelope they found in the room's drawer, and left. The dog insisted on accompanying them, and they let it, tying an improvised string around its neck as a leash. The small town by day had a different color, more vibrant, more real. The houses that seemed like ghosts yesterday now showed people on porches, children playing in the street, women chatting on the sidewalk. The general store was open with boxes of fruit out front. The town square had an old man sitting on a bench, reading a newspaper. They found the blue house easily. The iron gate was ajar, creaking softly with the wind. They knocked and waited. Heavy footsteps approached, and the door opened, revealing a tall man, broad-shouldered despite his age, with completely white hair and thick-lensed glasses. "Mr. Thompson?" Arthur asked. "Who's asking?" "My name is Arthur. This is my wife, Martha. Mrs. Eleanor Vance said you might be able to help us with some documents." The old man looked at them, at the dog, at the envelope in Arthur's hand. He sighed like someone tired of helping people but unable to say no. "Come in." The house was dark inside, full of stacked books, old furniture, smelling of paper and age. He led them to a room that looked like an improvised office, with a huge desk covered with papers, an old typewriter, crooked shelves holding more books. "Show me," he said, sitting in the chair that groaned under his weight. Arthur opened the envelope and spread the documents on the table. Deeds, certificates, records. Walt Thompson took out his glasses, cleaned the lenses, and began to examine them carefully. He turned pages, checked dates, read names, verified stamps. The silence stretched out, heavy, full of expectation. After a time that seemed eternal, he took off his glasses and looked at the couple. "This here is legitimate," he said, his voice grave. "These are old deeds, but valid, land registered in the name of—" He looked again at the document. "Joseph Miller. Was that your father?" Arthur nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "Yes, it was." "And are you the only child?" "No, I had a brother, but he passed away 10 years ago." "Children?" "He didn't have any. I had 3. Walt Thompson made some notes, calculated, mentally, and continued. "Then you are the sole direct living heir. These lands are yours by right. They need to be updated in the registry, of course. You'll have to go to the county seat, present your father's death certificate, your brother's death certificate, your personal identification. There will be fees, there will be bureaucracy, but they are yours." Martha squeezed her husband's hand tightly. Arthur tried to speak, but no sound came out. He tried again. "How much land?" Walt Thompson checked the numbers, did calculations on paper. "About 30 acres. It's not a lot, but depending on where it's located, it could be worth something. Where is it?" "On the border with Oklahoma," Arthur replied, remembering what he had read in the documents. The old man whistled softly. "That region is appreciating. People are looking for land there for farming, ranching, investment. If you want to sell, you'll get a fair price. If you want to keep it, you can make a living off the land. You won't be rich, but you'll have dignity." Dignity. The word echoed in the room like a bell. "And how do we do it?" Martha asked, her voice firm despite the emotion. How do we go to these places, make these registrations? Walt Thompson stroked his beard, thoughtful. You need to go to the county seat. It's a ways from here, but there's a bus that passes twice a week. You'll need money for the court fees. You'll need patience because bureaucracy takes time, but it's possible. If you like, I can write a letter explaining the situation. It makes things easier. We'll accept, Arthur said, and thank you. The old man nodded and began to write by hand, in neat cursive, a detailed letter explaining the land situation, the father's death, the succession, the valid documents. When he finished, he signed it and stamped it with an old stamp that still read Judicial Clerk. That stamp doesn't have legal value, he explained, but it commands respect, and sometimes that's all we need, a little respect. They returned to the inn with the documents organized, the letter written, and for the first time since their abandonment, a plan. It wasn't a perfect plan. It had holes, doubts, fears, but it was a plan. It was a path. It was something that depended on them, not on their children's goodwill, not on strangers' pity. That afternoon, sitting in the room, they organized everything. Martha took the notebook with her father-in-law's notes and began making a list of what they needed. Certificates, documents, money for fees, transportation to the county seat. Arthur held his father's letter again, reread it, letting the words penetrate deeper. Dignity is the only thing no one can take from you, unless you let them. He wasn't going to let them. Not anymore. The dog lay on the floor, chewing a piece of stale bread that Mrs. Eleanor Vance had given it. It seemed happy, content, oblivious to human problems, but every now and then it would lift its head and look at them, as if checking that they were okay, that they were together, that they were safe. That night, they dined again in the inn's kitchen. Mrs. Eleanor Vance made a vegetable soup and served it with bread. As they ate, Arthur told her about the land, about what they had discovered, about the plan to go to the county seat. She listened in silence, stirring the soup in her bowl, and then said, "Life's funny, isn't it? You think it's over, and then a door appears that you didn't even know existed." "It is," Martha agreed. "Funny isn't the word I'd use, but it's true. You'll need money for the fees." "We have a little," Arthur lied, because they had almost nothing, but he didn't want to ask. Mrs. Eleanor Vance wasn't foolish. She looked at him with those eyes that had seen many good lies in her life. "I'll lend it to you. You pay me back when you can. No rush, no interest. Just pay it back." Arthur wanted to refuse, but Martha squeezed his arm, a silent gesture that said, "Accept it, we need it." He swallowed his pride, nodded, and whispered, "We appreciate it." She nodded, as if it were nothing, but it was everything. It was the difference between being able to move forward or remaining stuck in place. Days passed. They waited for the bus to the county seat, organized documents, reviewed the plan, took care of the dog, who now had a name, Buddy. Because that's what he was, the only creature who chose to stay with them without asking for anything in return. The small town became familiar. People started greeting them on the street. The general store owner let them buy on credit. Children stopped to play with Buddy. It was strange but good, this feeling of belonging somewhere, even if temporary, even if it wasn't exactly home. On the eve of their trip to the county seat, Martha had a dream. She dreamed of her father-in-law, younger, working the land, his face tanned by the sun. He looked at her in the dream and simply said, "Take care of my son. He's stronger than he thinks." She woke with her heart pounding, the words echoing. She looked at her husband sleeping beside her, his hair disheveled, his face marked by time and suffering, and she thought, yes, he is strong, and she was too. They had to be. They had no choice. The bus left early. They took Buddy in a cardboard box with holes, because dogs weren't allowed loose. The journey was long, bumpy, hot, but they endured, firm, holding each other's hands, watching the changing landscapes outside the window, the hills falling behind, the city approaching. When they arrived, the county seat seemed enormous and daunting. Tall buildings, traffic, noise, hurried people, they felt small, out of place, too old for that world. But they had the documents, they had Walt Thompson's letter, they had each other. They entered the county clerk's office, hand in hand. The county clerk's office smelled of old paper and stale coffee. There were long lines, impatient people, tired-looking clerks. Arthur and Martha waited, not knowing where to go, until a young woman in a blue blouse asked if they needed help. "We need to sort out an inheritance," Martha said, showing the envelope with the documents. The young woman led them to a counter, called over an older clerk with glasses hanging around her neck on a golden chain. The woman examined the papers carefully, turning pages, checking dates, making notes on a pad. "When is this from?" she asked, without taking her eyes off the documents. "My father died 15 years ago," Arthur replied. "But we only just found these papers." She raised her eyebrows, surprised. 15 years? You left an inheritance for 15 years without regularizing it?" "We didn't know it existed," Martha explained, her voice firm. The clerk sighed, like someone who has seen everything and isn't surprised by anything anymore. "It's going to be a lot of work. You'll need updated certificates, a declaration of sole heirs, publication in the official gazette, payment of back fees. It won't be fast or cheap." "We'll pay," Arthur said, "whatever it takes." She did calculations, wrote down amounts, and presented a list that left them both pale. It was far more than they had, far more than Mrs. Eleanor Vance had lent them, far more than they could raise in months. They watched hope slip through their fingers like sand. They stood there, not knowing what to say, feeling the weight of the world fall back onto their shoulders. It was then that another person approached the counter, a man in a suit, about 40 years old, a leather briefcase under his arm, an attentive look. He had overheard the conversation unintentionally, and something about the couple's situation caught his attention. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help it. Do you own land on the border with Oklahoma?" Arthur looked at him suspicious. "Possibly." "I'm a rural real estate agent. I work with buying and selling land in that region. If you'll allow me to ask, do you intend to keep the land or sell it?" The couple exchanged glances. They hadn't thought of that yet. They had only thought of proving the land was theirs, of recovering what was rightfully theirs. But selling, it was a possibility that hadn't crossed their minds. "We don't know yet," Martha replied cautiously. The man nodded, understanding. "I see. But if you decide to sell, I can help. That region is in demand. People are looking for land for agriculture, ranching, investment. Depending on how many acres you have and where exactly it's located, it could be worth a significant amount." 30 acres, Arthur said, without thinking whether he should or shouldn't. "Reveal it." The agent's eyes lit up. 30 acres on the border with Oklahoma. "Look, without seeing the property, I can't give an exact value, but I'm talking about something between $200,000 and $300,000. Easily." The number floated in the air like something unreal. $200,000 to $300,000. They had never seen so much money together in their lives. They had never imagined they would be entitled to it. It was almost obscene to think of having so much when just a few days ago they had nothing but a suitcase and a dog. "Are you trying to trick us?" Martha asked, suspicious by nature. The man smiled, not offended. "No, ma'am. I can give you my card. You can do your research. See that I'm serious. I earn a commission if I sell it, so it's in my best interest for you to get the best price. But first, you need to regularize the inheritance, and if you need help with that, I know people who can expedite it." He held out a business card. Arthur took it, read, "Richard Miller, rural real estate agent, license Duggar1345. It had a phone. It had a number, address, email. It seemed legitimate. "We need to think," Arthur said. "Of course, think about it, but don't take too long. The land market doesn't wait, and if you want to sell, it's best to do it while it's valued high." He said goodbye politely and left. The couple stood there, still processing the conversation, the possibility, the number that had been thrown into the air. The county clerk had followed everything with interest. "He's serious," she said. "I know his work. If he says it's worth that much, it is. But there are also people who try to buy land for less than it's worth, so be careful. Do your research first." They thanked her and left the office, stunned. They sat on a park bench across the street, Buddy lying at their feet, and remained silent for a while, just breathing, trying to organize their thoughts. $200,000, Martha murmured. "Is that what he said?" It was. "We could what?" She looked at her husband, her eyes shining with something between hope and fear. "Start over. Buy a small house, live in peace, without depending on anyone." Arthur remained quiet, looking at his calloused hands full of age spots, hands that had worked a lifetime, hands that built, planted, carried weight, hands that were discarded by their own children as if they were worthless. "Do you think my father saved this thinking we would sell it?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "He saved it thinking we would have a choice," Martha replied, "and now we do." It was true. For the first time in a long time, they had a choice. They could try to keep the land, work it, make a living from it. Or they could sell it, take the money, build a new life. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about what made sense to them at this moment, at this age, with this history. They spent the rest of the day in the city, wandering aimlessly, talking, thinking. They stopped at a diner and shared a sandwich. They bought water and food for Buddy. They sat on a park bench and watched the afternoon fade, the movement lessen, the city lights turn on one by one. That night, they slept in a cheap motel near the bus station. The room was cramped and smelled of mildew, but it had a bed, a hot shower, a place for Buddy to sleep on the floor. Martha took a shower and cried under the spray, letting the water wash away everything that was trapped inside her. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed, holding the agent's business card, thinking. When she came out of the bathroom, in an old nightgown and wet hair, he said, "We should talk to someone before deciding anything, someone who understands this." "Who?" "I don't know. But we can't decide something like this alone. It's too much money, too much responsibility." She agreed and lay down beside him. They held hands, looking at the cracked ceiling, listening to the city noise outside. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Martha said, her voice low. "What?" "That the kids don't know any of this. They think they left us with nothing, that we're finished, dependent, weak, and we have $200,000 waiting." Arthur remained quiet. She continued, "I know it's not good to think like that. I know it's not about them. But I can't deny there's a part of me that wants them to know, that wants them to see. They were wrong." "I feel that too," he admitted. "But I don't know if it's right. It doesn't have to be right. It just has to be true." They slept late, restless, with confusing dreams. Arthur dreamed of his father, working the land under the sun. The old man looked at him and said, "Do what your heart tells you, son, but don't forget. Land doesn't betray. People do." The next morning, they returned to the small town by bus, with more questions than answers. But with something important too, perspective, the feeling that the future wasn't closed off, that there were still possible paths. Mrs. Eleanor Vance greeted them with hot coffee and genuine interest. "So, how did it go?" They told her everything. The valid documents, the high fees, the agent, the offer, the surreal amount. She listened in silence, stirring sugar into her coffee, and finally just said, "Life has a way of doing that. When you think it's over, it turns inside out and shows you another side." "What would you do?" Martha asked, "if it were you?" Mrs. Eleanor Vance thought for a long time before answering. "I think I'd do whatever brought me peace. Because money runs out, health runs out, but if you die without peace, you've died wrong." They spent a whole week thinking. They talked with Walt Thompson again, who gave the same advice as Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Do whatever brought them peace. They talked to the town pastor, who told them to pray and listen to what God put in their hearts. They talked to each other, long conversations on the inn's porch, watching the sun rise and set. In the end, they decided. They would sell the land. They would use the money to buy a small house in a quiet place where they could live the rest of their lives with dignity. They would save a portion for emergencies, so they would never depend on anyone again. And they would perhaps send a letter to their children, not to get revenge, not to humiliate, but to tell the truth, that they had survived, that they had worth, that they didn't need anyone's pity. They called the agent, scheduled a visit to the property, began the process of regularizing the inheritance, using the money borrowed from Mrs. Eleanor Vance and promising to pay her back as soon as the sale was finalized. It was a long road. There was paperwork, there was waiting, there was bureaucracy, but it was their road, chosen by them, decided by them. And for the first time since they had been abandoned on that road, they looked to the future and saw something beyond darkness. The trip to the property took almost the entire day. The agent picked them up in the small town in a comfortable car, air conditioning on, soft music playing. He was polite, professional, bringing maps, documents, technical explanations. He spoke of soil, water, access, appreciation. Arthur and Martha listened in, silence, trying to understand this new language, this world that had never been theirs. Buddy was in her lap, quiet, just observing the changing landscapes through the window. When they arrived, the sun was already high and strong. The property was in the middle of a rural area, surrounded by other larger holdings. It had pasture, some trees, a small creek cutting across one end. It was simple, but beautiful in an honest, unadorned way. Arthur stepped out of the car slowly and stood still, looking. For the first time, he was stepping onto something that was his. Something his. Father had saved, protected, left as an inheritance. He knelt down, picked up a handful of red earth, let it sift through his fingers. It was good soil, productive soil, valuable soil. "It's a good piece of land," the agent said, walking beside him. "Flat, with water, reasonable access. If you're open to it, I have 3 interested buyers. I can set up a private auction, let them bid against each other. You'll come out ahead." Martha had also gotten out. She stood there, breathing the clean country air, listening to the silence that only rural areas possess. She closed her eyes and tried to feel if there was any sign, any message from her father-in-law, any confirmation that they were doing the right thing. Nothing came. Only silence, only wind, only peace. "It's decided," she said, opening her eyes. "We'll sell it." The agent smiled, satisfied, and began to explain the next steps. Finalizing the inheritance regularization, getting all necessary certificates, scheduling buyer viewings, making the formal offer, signing the contract. It would take a few weeks, perhaps a month, but the money would come. And when it did, they would be free. They returned to the small town. In the late afternoon, tired but with the feeling that something important had happened. It wasn't just about the land. It was about choosing, about having a voice, about no longer being just victims of life, but participants in it. That night, Arthur wrote a letter. He borrowed paper and a pen from Mrs. Eleanor Vance and sat at the kitchen table while Martha washed dishes and Buddy slept under the chair. He wrote slowly, choosing each word carefully. "Children, I am writing this letter not to accuse, not to hurt, but to tell the truth. You left us on a road thinking we had nothing, thinking we were a burden, that we were the past, that we were disposable. And for a moment, we believed that too. But life taught us something different. We discovered we had more than we thought. Not money, not at first, but dignity, memory, roots, and land. Land your grandfather saved for when everything else failed. We are selling that land now. We will buy a small house and live in peace. We don't need you. We don't need pity. We don't need excuses. We just need you to know we survived. And we will die on our feet, not on our knees. Your father and mother." He folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and the next day went to the small town's post office. He sent it to his oldest daughter's address, who would likely share it with the other two. He didn't expect a reply. He didn't want a reply. He just wanted them to know. The following weeks were a wait. The county clerk's bureaucracy moved slowly, like all bureaucracy, but it moved. The documents were approved, certificates issued, signatures collected. The agent sent regular updates. Buyers remained interested. Arthur and Martha had fallen into a strange routine in the small town. They woke early, had coffee with Mrs. Eleanor Vance, went for walks with Buddy. They greeted neighbors. Sometimes they helped out at the general store. They went to church on Sundays. It was a simple life, almost provisional, but it had rhythm, it had meaning. It was on a rainy afternoon, 3 weeks after they sent the letter, that their children appeared. The screech of a car braking sharply in front of the inn made Mrs. Eleanor Vance look out the window. She saw 3 people, hurrying out, getting wet in the rain, climbing the porch steps. They knocked on the door loudly, impatiently. She opened it and saw faces she recognized from the description, young, well-dressed, with that expression of people used to getting what they want. "Where are our parents?" the oldest asked, without greeting, without politeness. Mrs. Eleanor Vance looked them up and down, unimpressed. "Who's asking?" "We're their children. We know they're here. We want to talk to them." She was about to answer when Arthur appeared at the top of the stairs. Martha was behind him. Buddy began to growl softly. There was a tense silence. The children looked at their parents. The parents looked at their children. 3 weeks hadn't been enough time to erase the wound of abandonment. "Come up," Arthur said, his voice calm but firm. They went up. Mrs. Eleanor Vance stayed downstairs, but left the door ajar, ready to intervene if needed. In the small room, the 5 were squeezed together, the children standing, restless, wet from the rain. The parents sitting on the edge of the bed, dignified, waiting. It was the middle son who started, his voice accusatory. "You own land, property, and you never said anything." "We didn't know," Martha replied calmly. "We found out after you abandoned us." "It wasn't abandonment," the oldest daughter retorted. "We were trying to help." "Help?" Arthur almost laughed, but it was a humorless laugh. "Is it helping to leave someone in the middle of the road with an old suitcase and a dog?" "You didn't understand the plan," the youngest insisted. "We were going to pick you up later, once everything was settled." "Settled what?" Martha asked, her voice rising. "The sale of our house? The division of our furniture? The discarding of our things?" "All. Without asking, without warning, treating us like children, like a burden, like nothing." The children were speechless. They looked at each other, searching for arguments they couldn't find. "But now," the oldest daughter began, changing strategy, "now that we know you have this land, we can help. We can manage the sale, invest the money, ensure you're taken care of." "No," Arthur said simply. "How no?" "We don't need you. We already have an agent. We already have a buyer. We already have a plan, and it doesn't include you." The silence that fell was heavy, almost solid. The children seemed unable to comprehend what they were hearing. They had always decided everything. They had always been in control. They were always the ones who said what was best. "You can't do this," the middle son said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "We're your children. We have a right." "A right?" Martha stood up, small but imposing. "You lost that right when you left us on that road, when you sold our house without asking, when you decided we had no more worth." "We made a mistake," the oldest daughter admitted, tears beginning to well up. "But we're family." "Family takes care," Arthur said, standing too. "Family respects. Family doesn't discard. You did none of that. So don't come now talking about family when all you really want is money." The youngest tried one last time, his voice desperate. "At least let us participate in the sale. Help in some way. You can leave," Arthur interrupted. "And this time, don't come back. Unless it's to genuinely apologize. Not for the money, but for what you did." The children stood there realizing they had lost, that there was no negotiation, no manipulation, no way to get what they wanted. The parents who had always said yes, who had always given in, who had always bent, had turned to stone. They left slowly in silence, descending the stairs under Mrs. Eleanor Vance's watchful eye. They got into the car, wet with rain and defeat, and drove away. Arthur and Martha stood at the window, watching the car disappear into the light rain. They didn't cry. They didn't celebrate. They just stood there together, holding hands, taking deep breaths. "Is it over?" Martha asked. "It's over," he replied. Buddy jumped onto the bed and lay down, finally relaxed, as if he knew the worst had passed. That night it rained heavily. The sound of the water on the roof seemed to wash away something old, some ancient dirt. They slept deeply for the first time in months, without bad dreams, without waking in the middle of the night with the weight of anguish. When dawn broke, the sky was clear, blue, new. The small town smelled of wet earth and a new beginning. The sale of the land was finalized 6 weeks later, on a clear, gentle morning. Arthur and Martha signed the papers at the county clerk's office, with Walt Thompson as a witness, and the agent guiding the entire process. When the last signature was given, when the last stamp was applied, when the money was transferred to the account they had opened specifically for this, there was a moment of silence. It was real. It had happened. They had $320,000, more than the agent had predicted, more than they had dreamed of, more than they needed. They didn't shout. They didn't jump. They just looked at each other, a small smile on their lips, and squeezed each other's hands tightly. Because it wasn't about the money. It was about what it meant, freedom. They paid Mrs. Eleanor Vance back with interest, even though she said it wasn't necessary. They paid Walt Thompson for his work, even though he protested. They gave a generous sum to the truck driver, whom they had tracked down with the help of the general store owner. They even paid the pastor, asking him to use it to repair the church roof. And then they started looking for a house. They wanted something simple, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom, a small porch. A small yard for Buddy to run in, near some shops, but away from the hustle. A place where they could grow old in peace, where no one knew them, where they could start fresh. They found one in a small town about 37 miles from the inn. It was an old but well-maintained house, painted a faded yellow, with wooden windows and a yard with a peach tree. It cost $70,000. There would be more than enough left to live the rest of their lives with dignity. They closed the deal that same week. The move was simple because they had hardly anything. The old suitcase, a few clothes bought with their new money, basic kitchen utensils, a mattress, 2 chairs. Nothing that wouldn't fit in a rented van. On the day they left the small town, they made sure to say goodbye to everyone. Mrs. Eleanor Vance hugged Martha tightly, her eyes moist, and said, "You deserve all the happiness in the world. And if you ever need anything, this door is always open." Walt Thompson gave Arthur a firm handshake and murmured, "Your father would be proud." The general store owner gave them a bag full of food for the journey. The children from the street came to say goodbye to Buddy, crying as if they were losing a friend. The pastor blessed the three of them at the church door. It was strange to have belonged to a place for so little time, and yet feel that they were leaving something important behind. But life was like that, made of arrivals and departures, of people who come and go, of places that touch the soul without warning. Their new house smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Arthur fixed a few things that were broken, painted the walls, replaced faucets. Martha organized the kitchen, planted flowers in the yard, sewed simple curtains for the windows. Buddy explored every corner, marked his territory, and quickly got used to it. Gradually, they built a routine. They woke early, had coffee on the small porch, listening to the birds. They walked to the town square, chatted with neighbors, shopped at the local market. They had lunch at home, took a nap, and in the late afternoon returned to the porch just to watch the sun set. It was a simple life, but it was theirs. No one dictated to them. No one decided for them. No one discarded them. 3 months after the move, they received a letter. It was from their oldest daughter. Arthur recognized the handwriting on the envelope and felt his stomach clench. Martha saw his expression and asked, "What is it?" "From the kids." She tensed. He did too. They stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. Finally he opened it and read aloud, "Dad, Mom, I'm writing on behalf of all 3 of us. It took time for us to put into words what we needed to say, and even now, I don't know if the words are enough. We messed up badly, deeply, in a way that has no easy excuse. We treated you as a burden when you were our support our whole lives. We made decisions for you when we should have asked. We forgot your history, your struggles, your sacrifice. It's not about the land, it's not about the money, it's about respect, and we didn't have it. We don't expect you to forgive us right away. Maybe you'll never fully forgive us, but we needed you to know. We know we were wrong, and we will carry that for the rest of our lives. If you ever want to talk, we'll be here. If you prefer never to see us again, we'll understand. Your children." The silence lasted a long time. Arthur folded the letter slowly, put it back in the envelope, placed it on the table. Martha looked out the window, her eyes distant. Buddy slept in the afternoon sun, oblivious to human dramas. "What do you think?" he asked. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "It hurts less, but it still hurts." "Me too." They sat there thinking, feeling, trying to decide what to do with that late apology. It wasn't easy to forgive. It wasn't easy to forget. But it also wasn't easy to live with anger all the time, with resentment weighing on their chests, with bitterness poisoning their days. "We don't have to decide now," Martha finally said. "That's true. Maybe one day, maybe never, but at least they asked. At least that." They put the letter in a drawer. They didn't reply right away. They needed time. They needed to process. They needed to feel if forgiveness was possible or if the wound was too deep. Months passed. The first winter in the new house was cold but cozy. They bought an old wood-burning stove, the kind that heats the whole house. They spent their evenings there, sitting by the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes chatting about small things, sometimes reminiscing about old stories. Martha started crocheting, a skill she had abandoned years ago. She made doilies, pot holders, small rugs. She sold some at the town's craft fair, more for the pleasure of talking to customers than for the need for money. Arthur refurbished the peach tree in the yard, which was almost dying from neglect. He pruned it, fertilized it, watered it patiently. In spring it flowered, in summer it bore fruit. They made jam, ate peaches with cheese, gave some to neighbors. It was a life without big events, without violent emotions. But it had rhythm. It had meaning. It had peace. One autumn day, almost a year after the move, Arthur woke up and said, "I think we could answer the letter." Martha looked at him, surprised. "Are you sure?" "I don't know if I'm sure, but I think holding on to anger is more tiring than forgiving." She thought for a moment and nodded. "What do we write?" They spent the entire morning thinking, scribbling, tearing up paper, starting over. In the end, it was simple. "Children, we received your letter. It took time, but we received it. We won't say everything is fine. It's not. Maybe it never will be completely, but we also don't want to die with anger in our hearts. If you want to visit us, you can, but come without expectations. Come just to talk, to be near, to perhaps mend what can be mended. We have a small house, a simple life. We can't offer much beyond coffee and conversation. But if that's enough, the door is open. Dad and Mom." They sent the letter and didn't expect an immediate reply. But it came 3 weeks later, by phone. The oldest daughter called, her voice trembling, asking to visit them that weekend. They accepted. When the children arrived on a Saturday morning, the atmosphere was tense. Awkward hugs, strange silences, gazes that didn't know where to land. But gradually, the ice began to crack. They talked on the porch. They had coffee. Buddy helped, being friendly with everyone, drawing involuntary laughs. It wasn't instant healing. It wasn't complete reconciliation. But it was a beginning, a step, a possibility that perhaps with time, with effort, with truth, something could be rebuilt. When the children left, Arthur and Martha stood on the porch, tired but not broken. They looked at each other and didn't need to say anything. They already knew they would try. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. Right by themselves, by the memory of her father-in-law, by the chance to die in peace. Life continued slowly, at its own pace. The seasons changed. Buddy aged with them, calmer, wiser, always by their side. The children visited occasionally, always cautious, always trying to mend what they had broken. Arthur never again opened the suitcase's secret compartment, but he knew it was there, stored, always reminding him where they had come from, what they had survived, the love of a father who thought of him even after death. Martha continued crocheting, selling at the fair, chatting with neighbors. Arthur continued caring for the peach tree, planting other things in the yard, slowly building a garden that was his. They didn't get rich, they didn't get famous, they didn't have a fairy tale ending, but they stood tall, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. One afternoon of gentle sun, almost at the end of another year, Arthur was sitting on the porch when Martha came out with 2 glasses of iced lemonade. She handed him one, sat beside him, and they stayed there, just looking at the yard, listening to the pleasant silence of the afternoon. "We made it," she said softly. "Made what?" "Survived, with dignity." He looked at his wife, at her now completely white hair, at the wrinkles that time and suffering had etched on her face, but also at the eyes that still sparkled, at the small but true smile, at the calloused hands that held the glass firmly. "Yes," he agreed. "We made it." Buddy came to lie at their feet, his snout resting on Martha's leg, and the 3 of them stayed there together as the sun slowly set, painting the sky orange and pink. It wasn't the end of the story, it was just the end of a chapter, and the beginning of so many others, yet unwritten, yet unlived, but possible. Because as long as there is life, there is possibility, and as long as there is dignity, there is hope. And they finally had both. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.